Hi, welcome to Hoko Palizzo's The Writing Life. I'm Richard McKeon, and our guest today is Belinda McKeon. We're very glad to have here. She's the author of the award-winning novel Solace, and more recently the author of the gorgeous novel Tender. She comes to us from Ireland. She's from County Longford. She's been living in New York for some time now, and we're really glad to have you here.
Thank you so much, Richard.
It's my pleasure.
Nice
Very
to
much.
be here.
I have so many questions I want to ask, both about Solace and about Tender, but maybe starting with Tender. One of the things I've heard you say about the novel is that it's autobiographical to its core.
Yeah.
To its core.
Yeah.
It's there. And so I wanted to ask you about that, not necessarily what is the autobiographical part, but what brought you to wanting to or needing to write autobiographically when you got to the time of this novel?
I think that was my second novel, and I think I needed that kind of run-in, to feel, I suppose, just to have the courage to write something that I couldn't really disguise in certain ways as in terms of its autobiography. It was a story I really wanted to tell. The characters, Catherine and James, really had been with me as characters for a very long time. I mean, the preliminary notes for what would become Tender, I started in 1998, 1999.
During the time of the novel.
Pretty much, exactly. And so I knew that I wanted to get to write that, write those characters and write that dynamic between a young woman and her closest friend, who was a essentially closeted gay man.
Right.
But it wasn't something that I was able, I think, to take on, not just in terms of, being nervous about personal material, but the act and the business of writing autobiographical fiction is really quite complicated. You think at first that it's just a matter of getting life and your memory of what happened down on the page. Right. But it's actually as I discovered, Tender took 4 years, and a lot of that was almost like a technical wrestling with the challenge of drawing on lived experience while turning it into fiction. So I say that it's autobiographical to its core because I feel as though, that the trunk of the tree is autobiographical.
Right.
But what comprises the rest of the tree it had to be fictional because you have to give story a shape. And even though life always feels, when you look back over your life, you feel that it had a shape, it doesn't really in the same way as a piece of fiction needs to.
One might feel it has a shape looking back, right, exactly.
But then when you start to write down everything that happened, very quickly you see that there's not a logic, and it's really, it doesn't add up. It won't work as fiction, essentially. It won't right. gain the momentum and the drive that a story needs to work.
So that sense of finding a story, of turning autobiography toward fiction, what are the challenges of that process?
Well, for me, what the first challenge was understanding, sort of tamping down the panic. And again, it's not what you would expect, perhaps, although I'm assuming, what readers expect. It's not a matter of am I going, is this going to cause terrible trouble? Am I going to, it's very exposing, obviously. I am a pretty private person, although this has sort of put the cat among the pigeons on that score. That's not what the panic comes from. It's just watching the material refuse to cooperate, even though there's so much of it. And with Solace was not autobiographical in that way, and that was a totally different process of managing material, of almost willing the material to come and waiting for the story to show itself. But with material that's personal and that you feel where you feel you're drawing on life, at first you think the material should just come, almost that you should be a sort of transcriber of a novel, that it should just show up. And when it doesn't, when it turns out to be terrible, you're writing all of this down and it's just so shapeless and melodramatic and endless also. I mean, I write longhand, so I'm able to see how many attempts there were putting shape on Tender, and I have probably 14, large, long notebooks of longhand, that most of which was discarded. So it was a year and a half into the process where I hit the first line, and
a gorgeous line.
That just gave me the shape, and it's just a process of listening and waiting. That for me was the biggest early challenge. And then after that, there does come another panic where you think, oh, actually, this is going, this is a book that I'm going to have to try and publish, and people will read it.
And there's people here.
Yeah,
right,
exactly.
Right.
But also trying to do justice to the story while not, betraying it or over dramatizing it, but also trying not to tidy it up. Life is very messy, and this is a very messy story of obsession and fear and inherited fear.
Desire.
And desire, exactly. So with that, for me, in terms of it being autobiographical, I just had to sort of gird myself a lot and say, just keep going. You have to get the book done, and then you can decide how you feel about it.
Well, in that girding, having autobiographical sources, did you feel a special sort of responsibility to the book, a different responsibility than one might feel when it's all invention and imagination?
Yeah, I think I did. And it's funny because I say I think I did because I've actually forgotten a lot of what the emotional process felt like. But I know, I keep a journal when I'm writing, and I know that I was concerned for, I just wanted to tell the story as truthfully as I could without taking advantage of it in a way. Or, I was conscious, and it eventually became a theme in a way in the novel. I was conscious of also appropriating another person's story. The story is told from Catherine's point of view, but it's as much James's story as it is Catherine's. Right. And I was very conscious of telling that story of a young man in 1990s Ireland struggling to come out, and of the responsibilities involved with that. So on a couple of levels, I was acutely aware of that. And so it was an emotional process, I would say. I really feel that the book was all nerve. It was nerves. The nerves felt like they were on the surface of my skin for those 4 years. And then publishing it, I just went into a sort of denial. You go into a self-protective bubble where it feels surreal.
How nice to return to that life.
Exactly.
Yeah, the characterization of Catherine and James is really quite incredible. And you've mentioned, and one of the things I love about Tender is the incredibly subjective point of view from which we're seeing things through Catherine's eyes. And I think partly that's because she's, with so much introspection and interiority within it, and she's a person who's given to that herself. That's why it looks like that. So it's really really a novel that seems to me to be exposing the way a mind works in ways it itself doesn't recognize. And the reader, I think, gets much quicker on to the fact that James may be gay, than Catherine gets, and so on.
Yeah.
I love that subjectivity. What made that important to you in the telling of this story?
Well, it's important to me as a reader. Many of my favorite books are books which do that to an almost unbearable extent, really get into the quick of the mind as it's working. And as you say, I love that description that the mind might not know itself what it's seeing and understanding. I love Bowen's portrait of, although it's not entirely just close third person, but Bowen's portrait of Lois in The Last September, another young woman on the precipice of enormous discovery and change. And one of my favorite novels of really the last of all for me is Alan Hollinghurst's The Line of Beauty, which also has that incredible, uncompromising subjectivity where you are so close to the consciousness and the thought process and all those human foibles and flaws and all the little embarrassing moments of the protagonist that you can't escape, and it can feel a little claustrophobic. And I wanted to write for Catherine, especially because she's young. She's only, also like Lois, she's 18 when the novel opens.
And rather naive when it begins.
Very much, very green, and extremely self-conscious and neurotic, really. A very sheltered childhood has done that much for her. And I knew, and there were different experiments where I tried to write in first person, and then for a long time at the beginning, during that panic I mentioned to you, that year-long, longhand panic, I did think of writing the novel entirely from the point of view of a Catherine in her mid-30s, looking back at her teenage self, which would have been a self-protective strategy as much as anything else, because that would have lent the kind of wisdom and wryness, wryness at least, and self-irony self-ironization of a later, a later person, where you look back at your teenage self and think, God, what an idiot I was. But I felt that would have been really a cop-out, and that I had to plunge into the messy, cringy quick of what it was to be Catherine at 18. And that's the language had to reflect that.
Well, I think one of the things that makes the novel work well is that one has the sense, while reading it, that this is a complicated task, and that that it might be pricey, in a sense, to be that long in such a subjective point
Yeah.
of view. And for the reader, of course, it makes quite a difference too, I think, because the reader at once is powerless to do anything about the way she's perceiving things. One wishes to sort of, to give her a caution,
Yeah.
here and actually rather often at times.
Right.
And creates a really interesting relationship to Catherine. What do you see as your relationship to Catherine?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. I mean, I'm so close to her.
Yeah.
There's so much of myself in her, my current self and my younger self. I do feel sympathy for her. I do feel compassion, I suppose, for that sort of frantic subjectivity. And I think one often looks back at one's younger self and thinks, it was all going to be okay. You didn't need to be so scared and panicky and anxious and, terrified and jumpy and trying to do everything at once. And, things will be fine-ish.
I was going to say, I still feel like...
I mean, I'm not practicing what I preach. But I do have compassion for her in that way, but I also do want to shake her. I mean,
shake her for not seeing what's going on in her own life or with herself?
Well, because, one of the things about Catherine, she's not a terribly likable character. And one of the reasons for that is that she is controlling. I think she's learned control as a relationship tool, a relationship device from home, I suppose. And so she's very controlling of James, and she's not at all a selfless character.
Right,
and so
right.
those aspects of her, I want, they make me cringe, but they were really important to see through to their utter, awfulness.
The unsparing,
Yeah.
endless self, right?
Exactly,
Right.
and also the narcissism. I mean, I think we're all fascinated by narcissism at this stage. We have no choice, but it's very...
Were we not before?
Not enough, it seems.
Okay.
But I think it's a really interesting thing to write about, or to write from, that... Are all first-person perspectives narcissistic? Or, this is not a first person, but are all close third-person perspectives narcissistic?
Very, very close third person. Right,
Almost, yeah.
Right.
Is the novel inherently a narcissistic enterprise?
So many enterprises are, it's true, right.
But I think Catherine made me think, Tender and Solace for me are very different novels, and I think she forced me to learn a different way of writing. And one of the things I didn't allow myself to do with Tender, which I very much did with Solace, was I didn't allow myself to lean on the beauty of what's not said and the power of the unspoken. And in Solace, which is a family story, particularly a father-son story, which is very much an Irish theme and an Irish mould, I was drawing a lot on that tradition that I had learned and imbibed of the heavy silences, the meaning, you throw a good metaphor in there when the men won't speak to each other. But with Tender, I did want to. My instinct was to rush towards the comfort of that spareness, but I didn't want to allow myself because I wanted to see what it would look like on the other side if you put everything down.
Right.
Can you still produce fiction? Mm-hmm. If you're Irish.
If you're Irish, and letting it all be revealed.
Yeah, exactly.
In that sense. This strikes me as a good moment to ask you to read just a wee bit from the beginning of Tender.
Okay.
And asking largely because it begins in such a subjective mode, and it's gorgeous.
Thank you. Well, this is the section I mentioned, which just sort of, after a year and a half or so of work, just sort of turned up one morning, and I knew that I had found, the beginning, not just the beginning of the novel, but the voice in some way.
Yeah.
Dreams fled away, and something about a bedroom, and something about a garden seen through an open window, and a windfall, something about a windfall, a line which made Catherine see apples, bruising and shrivelling and rotting into the ground. Windfall sweetened soil, that was it, and the flank of an animal rubbing against a bedroom wall, though that could not be right, could it? But it was in there somewhere, she knew it was. Something of it had bobbed up in her consciousness as she lay on the lawn in front of James's house, a wool blanket beneath her, one arm thrown over her eyes to do the job of the sunglasses she had not thought to bring. The French windows were open. They were to the left of the front door, which seemed a bit strange or pointless or something. If you wanted to walk out to the front of the house, wouldn't you just use the door? Still, they were nice, elegant, that was what they were, and modern, and through them now came the noise of James and his parents, talking in the loud, excited way this family had. His mother shrieked at something James had said, and James swore at her, the fond, gleeful kind of swearing they did all the time, this family. Catherine could not get over them.
Thank you.
No
That's
problem.
Really nice to hear. Listening to it just now, I was thinking of how much, a novel, of course, is you read it backwards as well as forwards, and so when you go back to any passage, it's informed by everything that
That's
you
right.
didn't know when that passage was coming to you the first time. And it's the image of Catherine with her hand flung over her eyes to protect herself
Right.
from the sun that seems so staggering, because one of the real journeys I think that Catherine has to make is to learn how to see things, not just from her own romanticism, and from the point of view in which she gets what she wants, but rather to see things more squarely. I don't know what this means to say, but as they are, kind of thing. Right.
As they are for other people, I think. To allow other people their subjectivity, not just to insist that your subjectivity, and that's what I mean about narcissism in a way, that
Right.
not just to insist that your subjectivity and the way that you want to see the world is the way that it must be, that other people, James and also her other friends, must fall in line,
Right,
with,
right.
but particularly James, of course, because he becomes the object, he becomes the lost object that she's
Right.
desperately trying to hold on to.
And his breach by coming out is the most extreme in the novel.
Yeah, yeah, he's not. So I think the moment of coming out is confusing for her, again because of her naivety. But when he begins to find himself and begins to try, painfully, to make his way as a young man who's gay, and to try and meet people and just to try and live his life as himself, then she begins to panic. And those were difficult, painful passages to write, because I always want to, you always have, at least I did, have a self-protective instinct to say, oh God, don't make, let's tone her down a bit. This is terrible behavior. But to do justice to they're behaving like this because they've inherited certain ways of thinking and certain ways
Right.
of panicking and fearing. So to portray that sort of inherited and to portray the ramifications of the culture, I needed to show the extremes of bad behavior, really, and of, panicked, worried behavior. Yeah.
I love that description. Is there. Excuse me. One of the things that you brought up was the spareness in Solace.
Yeah.
And I find there's a spareness in Tender as well. That is to
Really?
say that it's not, fabulistic in any kind of way, nor does it turn into the language is beautiful. The sentences are beautiful, but it never turns into languaging in a certain kind of earlier
Right.
Irish mode.
Yeah.
Of just let that language go and
Right.
whoosh, kind of
Yeah.
thing. And it also, in terms of the prose, makes me think about what is contemporary Irish novel, the prose of that novel like, and what did it used to be in the 20th century or the 19th century, where I guess probably when one thinks of the 20th century, I think one thinks, at least in America, of Frank McCourt, and the kind of language that he used to do, and the highly anecdotal kind of story structure. What do you see as being your way of, or if it's how to put this, your way of being Irish and not being in that old mode?
Yeah, and it's constantly changing for me. And I think that being an immigrant, I've lived in the US for 12 years now, it really has put me at a distance from what my contemporaries in Ireland are doing. I don't feel part of that scene in the same way that I would have, I presume, if I'd lived there.
Naturally. Right.
So I think, to be honest, it's really, and it will change with my next novel as well. I do feel myself becoming just less interested in the inherited modes of writing. But of course, I'm generalizing when I say that. And I suppose what I mean is the option on the one hand of that spareness that I mentioned, or this sort of language for the sake of the beauty of language. Allowing the language to just run amok on the page so that the reader could get distracted by its fabulousness and not really notice that the shape of the novel isn't really holding up. To me, rhythm is more important almost than language.
I love the idea that fabulousness can cover a lack of shape.
I think. Well, I think,
see what you're saying exactly.
I think it
right.
does a lot of the
Right,
time. I think
right.
you'll often see a novel that's just so inventive and so the writer has such a gift for language, and yet there's so many holes in the plot. And there are many holes in the plots of Tender and Solace as well. But I think it's your primary responsibility as a novelist to try and make the shape. To observe and to obey the rules that you create for yourself as a novelist, anew with each novel, And it's just not enough to say, oh, look at this sentence. That's not good enough.
Right, right.
And it's not a uniquely Irish thing, but it is a little bit.
What then do you want from a sentence? You're a great sentence writer.
For me, it's rhythm. I mean, really, I hear the sentences. When I write a sentence, I know whether it's working just by my inner ear. I'm not particularly interested in words. I'm very interested in just the do of the language. It's almost more a form of poetry in a certain way.
That beginning you read is certainly an example of that.
Well, that is. She's thinking about Another September, the Thomas Kinsella poem,
right.
which we all had to learn by heart in school as 17-year-olds.
I took that because it comes up several times. I took it that it must be a cultural moment.
That's right. Yeah, it's a poem about a man, realizing that he's aging and he's in his 30s. And I'm actually confusing the two Thomas Kinsella poems that are on the Leaving Cert syllabus in Ireland. But it's the kind of poem that, and his wife is waking up beside him. As we had to learn it by heart as 15 and 16-year-olds in Ireland for the final exam. Everybody had to learn the same poems. Which is also a very rigid way of educating people, but
we had that too.
Right.
Oh, Captain, my Captain. Oh, wow. Right.
That's perfect for teenagers.
It is, isn't it? Yeah.
Whereas this was something that I think I'm only now beginning. In my late 30s, I now empathize. I'm older than the characters in these poems, but the way that language and Catherine, in a sense, is trying to unearth the rhythms that have become embedded in her own consciousness. She remembers the beginning of the poem, but she can't remember the rest of it, and these windfall sweetened soil and the image of this animal. It's a dreamscape really of an animal in the bedroom rubbing their flank against the bedroom wall as the speaker wakes up beside his wife. But I think the discipline of the poem has always been really important to me, and that's maybe what I aspire to in a sentence, more than storytelling almost. Yeah. But as I say, it changes all the time. I mean, I feel myself, and I hope that I will continue to change as a writer. That the next book will be maybe not even Irish.
Well, I was wondering about that, of course, because you were in Brooklyn for 11 years, and now you're in Newburgh, New York. And surely, this is a sizable amount of time.
Yeah.
And I've wondered if, what sort of Americanness might have rubbed off on you. But I also wonder what you see in your daily life here that attracts your attention compared to, say, one's daily life as it was in Dublin.
I think in Ireland, because I grew up there and because it's so small and it's such a, it's really, the community is very tight-knit. So I spent my childhood and my teenage years at home in Longford on a small farm in a small community, rural community where everybody knew everybody. Then I moved to Dublin and I was part of a very small community at college. The campus of Trinity is in the middle of the city. It's a great place to go to college really for that reason. Then I graduated and became a journalist, and I became part of that I mostly wrote about books and theatre, so I was part of that scene, and so in each case I was part of a small community where everybody knew everybody else, and there was a sort of familiarity with types and with people. And I think the writer, so Solace came out of the writer I was in Ireland. I started it when I still lived in Ireland, and the preoccupation with the family and with social structures, I think, that still exists in Tender, that's my Irish self, I think. Right. Now, having lived in the US for 12 years, both in Brooklyn and now in a smaller city upstate, I think I'm more interested in almost how people behave in a civic way. And I don't mean in terms of responsibilities, but how, the people that I know and that I see on a day-to-day basis are my neighbours. They're not my family anymore. And I don't really know them. And I don't have any emotional obligations towards them. I
go looking to keep it like that.
Yeah, well, there is a self-protective strategy to that. And also, I think for a writer, you can imagine whatever you like about those people. They can become the germ of a novel or a story, and you don't ever have to face them. Whereas if you're going to write about your family or out of your family of origin and out of that story, I don't know. It's different. There's a different emotional bind. So I think of myself as a more scattered gatherer of material now than I was in Ireland, where it was almost an instinctive back towards the home, back towards the rhythms of the family. And in a small town like Dublin, it's almost a family anyway.
Well, in both Solace and in Tender, there's a repeated I don't know whether to call it a setting or a conflict. It's both, actually, between people coming from the country, from
Yeah.
County Longford, your
In both
county,
cases,
exactly,
yeah.
and then going to the more urban,
Yeah.
modern, more educated Dublin. And so I wonder, like, how does New York fit in that trajectory? Like, from farm to Dublin to New York. Is it the movement of greater and greater anonymity, of away from that village life?
Yeah, it is. That's actually what I love about living here is just not. I mean, being in a neighborhood and not being a person who people know everything about. I think I feel an immense freedom here in that way. Of course, freedom is a fraught subject, but personally, I just like to walk around and think, God, nobody gives a crap about me here. I'm unobserved and almost invisible.
Right.
And I think that just frees my own head up a lot more. And I think, the last section of Tender is set in New York, or
Yes, right.
in a strange part of New York, or not often written about part of New York, which is Randall's Island off
I
the
think
coast
actually,
of Manhattan.
in my experience, it never written
Yeah,
about
I think it
part
might be
of New York.
the
Right.
first fiction set on Randall's Island, because there's an art fair taking place on the island, and Catherine and James are there. And that was my first time writing about New York, or writing from New York. I tried it in my earlier years living here. I was doing my graduate study in fiction, and I had to produce a lot of short stories on deadline, and I tried a couple of times at Columbia. I tried a couple of times to write stories set in New York, but they never rang true and they never worked. I was forcing it. But what I noticed with the last section of Tender was that it bubbled up organically. It made absolute sense for me to write a piece set in New York. And what's more, it was a lot of fun to write that section. That section came together in 2 days. And didn't really need to be edited at all. Whereas if the third and fourth section took, a year and a half.
It's formally so structured that it feels hardly believable.
It's like a little short film.
Not mean that. Not
Oh, the
mean
novel,
editing
you
that way.
mean?
The novel, right?
Yeah.
Exactly.
No, but that's something about, I suppose I had been holding the experience of living here and observing and being an immigrant, and being an outsider, but always observing. And what I found was that when I needed to write this last section, it just came. And so my hope for the next novel is that I will be able to write out of the experience of living in the U.S.
My hope for the novel is that I want to read it. I want to see what comes next.
Well, my agent, Anna Stein, here in New York, who read the last section, I say it didn't need any editing, but Anna did say to me, you have lots of turns of phrases in there that you're giving to your American characters, and they're completely Irish.
Right.
And I said, no, they're not. And she
Right.
said, no, they're tiny things you don't notice, but they're tiny things.
American people say right royal pain and
then,
things like that.
She
right,
pointed
right.
them out to me, and I said, oh, God, they're so small. I didn't realize, of course, it makes sense, but I didn't realize the nuance. And so I don't know if I can write an entirely non-Irish novel the next time. But,
Well, I don't think that's an assignment. I've loved these Irish, even with the end in New York. It's a pleasure having you, and I'm really glad to have spent this time with you. I wish
Thank
we could
you,
go on
Richard.
for a good bit longer. I love listening to you talk about your work.
Thank you so much.
So I want to thank you, and I also want to thank the audience for joining us today on this edition of Hoko Palizzo's The Writing Life. It's been a pleasure to be part of it.